side note, but because I mentioned that, if you are feeling like you're having problems getting your feet off of the floor in time, it's probably your pitch. So check that out.
It's always pitch. It
Yeah.
comes back to that. Hello and welcome to another zany episode of Nerdy West Coast Swing, the podcast with pixels where the anchors are out of this world and the points don't matter. We are here to help train your eyes so you can learn faster and dance better. I'm Cassie Winter.
I'm Alicia Marshall. If you're wondering who are we to be analyzing these pros, Cassie and I both have extensive training and experience in both partnered and solo dancing. Cassie has about 23 years and I about 25. So tonight we are taking a look at Joel Torgeson and Chantelle Pianetta. It's a demo from their time in Hawaii.
Link is in the chat, so go ahead and give it a watch. When you're done, we'll get to you analyzing.
So we're talking about teamwork tonight, and there's so many different ways in our dance that teamwork comes into play. And I think that not only does it come in like working with your partner to do something, but giving them the space to do something, and also keeping an eye on what they're doing and possibly mirroring yourself. There's just so many different ways that you can talk about teamwork, and I think we'll probably touch on quite a few of them.
I think tonight we were talking about like listening, that particular element of teamwork.
Yes, but that's what I want to mention. There's a bunch of different ways that you can interpret teamwork in our dance. And so, like you said, tonight we're focusing on listening mostly, but I'll probably point out some other moments as well.
Yeah, because you can't really tease listening apart from the whole context of teamwork.
Right.
But overall, I think the thing that I'm going to be probably the hill I'm going to be dying on tonight is just how patient both Joel and Chantelle are this entire dance. And it's so beautiful that they're not rushing. They're letting what happens and not putting an agenda on top of it, which is extra helpful for such a slow song. Because if you're not willing to be patient and to listen and take more time to make decisions, even if you're on time, you can still look rushed to a slower song when you have kind of an agenda behind your decisions. To the screen share. So even if we just take this first section, because one of the things we talk about a lot here on Nerdy is making sure the beginning of your dance is small enough that you have somewhere to go, right? But what's really neat is how this starter step develops between the two of them. So it starts out with a really simple side step with a drag to collect, and then a settle and another shift of weight. And this is the kind of connection where Chantelle could choose to just continue walking and basically be doing the same thing that Joel is doing. But she decides to turn it into a ride. And it's such a subtle shift that she is making to make that transition. But because they are not rushing through things, and because it's one of those, it's a natural transition based on the connection they were already in, it's not jarring. And basically, as long as Joel is paying attention, which he was, it's really easy for him to then just make the ride happen. And then I love how they don't leave closed position at the end of that ride, because the tendency is after you've done anything remotely higher energy in closed position than just a triple step, there's this internal drive to be like, I must escape closed position. This is uncomfortable.
I think the main thing that I wanted to add, because you did mention that we do frequently talk about like not just going into, the beginning of the music at 100%. And the choice that Chantelle makes to turn this into a ride with a ronde, it can be higher energy, but the way that she does it doesn't really make it so much that way. So rather than her like intentionally swinging her leg around, she lets it drag behind and then release. All right, so her left hip is kind of like hanging back. And so as she's moving past where her foot is planted on the floor, she's just kind of releasing it and letting it naturally fall around her. And so that keeps it more low energy. And I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because there would be a way that you could dance this as a follow that would put like a lot of energy into the hips, that when that energy gets released, it releases a lot of energy really fast and it accelerates. But like you said, she's keeping it much simpler, lower energy, so that release doesn't have a drastic impact on the speed at which they're going.
And Joel does a really good job of keeping her over her standing foot.
Yes, really good job. And it's interesting. I remember in the before times, I was teaching a private lesson for a small gaggle of students. It was 4 students, and we were doing 2 hours together. And rides was one of the topics. And what was interesting is one of my students thought they'd gotten really good at leading rides, but the common denominator was the follow that they were practicing with just happens to be a really small person and really lightweight. And you blink at them and you stabilize them, kind of a situation. And so when this student went to lead me in a ride, it was very off balance. And so
I would imagine.
I know it's very exciting, but good thing I know how to not kill myself, so that's helpful. I prefer to use that power of mine to like eat my leaders, so they know how much power to be prepared for when they get a Ferrari. That's more fun personally. But what were you gonna ask?
I was just saying, I don't think we've done a full episode just on like rides, have we?
Yeah, we should do that.
Yeah, because I was watching these 2 dancers like trying to work on rides a handful of weeks ago, and the way they were going into it was like, I feel like that needs to be better explained.
Right. So I guess a quick like teaser before we get around to a full episode on that is it's not just getting into a position and then trying to maintain that position. You're actually having to keep momentum going. There's a momentum away from each other that you need to maintain and make sure it's equal and opposite, as opposed to one of you go exiting orbit. we're not trying to like lasso around the sun to come home or anything like that. No, we're just trying to maintain an orbit. That's it. No launching.
Ideally, no.
Yeah, and it involves both partners sharing a center and having intention away from that center at the same rate and direction. When those get thrown off in either role, it starts to devolve quickly.
Yeah. And I also want to add that in terms of really any kind of ride that you can go into, a lot of times as a follow specifically, you should kind of ease into it, and you'll hit this point where you just kind of hold and things kind of stay the same for a little bit. I want to say that generally for these rides, you should always be active in terms of being able to adjust in a second, because with the momentum, like if anything gets a little off, like you need to be able to ease out of things safely. So
and then real quick before we move on, I just want to highlight the shape that they're in, because they're both
really nice,
arced ever so slightly, which
Mm-hmm.
is creating that centripetal, it's basically centripetal force is what we're dealing with in a ride. And so you can see how their hips are trying to move away more than their feet, which are creating the shared axis, and then their connection
Mm-hmm.
point, which is keeping their upper bodies closer together. And as we move through, it changes ever so slightly because of Chantelle's hip weight. And now we have like a parabola in this position where there's also centripetal force at this angle, in addition to the one that was in this direction before. So it's not necessarily taking away from this kind of energy. It's just adding a variable to it to make it more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Really, really nice technique from both of them on this.
Yeah. And then I think this is what I was saying when you were helping Coco out of the room, was that I really appreciate that they didn't go into open position after that, right? Especially for the tone of the song. Instead, they go into this really almost intimate moment of just simple weight transfers in kind of like a double compression kind of feel in closed position. And it's absolutely lovely. It's just a moment of them listening to each other. It's basically all it is.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely
lovely. As a follow, these are the types of moments where, like, if you are powering your own movement, you'll just power right through these types of moments. And so it really takes, you know, that attention from Chantelle to what's going on for her to be like, okay, cool, we're just going to hang out right here for a little bit. Because she's not being led into anything else. So in theory, she should not be moving. She should just naturally want to stay where she's at. But it you know, a lot of times it does take some extra attention to what's going on in the partnership.
Yeah. And I would say this is when the psychology of a follow, your desire to be on time with your one is something that we get kind of like drilled into us almost from our novice or newcomer days. Be on time on your one. And that mindset can prevent us from really anchoring properly in normal timing, or in this kind of situation where more listening and more waiting is warranted. So it can feel really uncomfortable as a follow to kind of basically give yourself permission to be late on one, but it can be a really helpful tool to practice listening. You don't whip it out on the comp floor. I'm not saying do that. This is a practice tool to practice listening and giving yourself the time and the space to really listen to what your leader is leading you to do between your anchor and your one. And finally, we are out of closed position, but that was like a decent chunk of the song. This was the opening. And I also really appreciate how Joel did something a little unconventional for a send out, in that he did a telemark and he sent himself out. Thought that was a really cool choice.
That's the type of thing that requires a follow to really be following, or else things could not go so smoothly.
Yeah. And we've done a whole episode on telemarks, so we won't go into too much depth here. But this is a really lovely one. And actually, it's a nice angle to really see the change in floorboards for Chantelle. So Chantelle is on these floorboards here. And then as she dances her and 4, she ends up on this floorboard. And that's what is basically allowing Joel to have his own slot that he can dance through. So his slot is essentially in between those two that he gave Chantelle.
Yeah.
So that way he can dance through it.
Mm-hmm.
And then also just want to highlight how lovely of a job he's doing of accommodating her so she's not having to reach to the high heavens to clear his head.
Always appreciated.
Always appreciated.
I love that Chantelle takes this opportunity when she's kind of been told to like hang out there. And she just kind of like slowly shapes into something really nice while she's waiting on him, but she doesn't change anything about the connection necessarily. So she just kind of sinks into it further and creates a really nice shape. So she's still like really working with Joel because she's not changing up anything, but she's adding a little bit extra. So
this is another one of those instances where the newer you are in your following journey, this is not a follows third foot anchor. Her left foot is out in front, and her feet are more separated. So getting comfortable with allowing yourself to land in a shape and maintain that shape, not only through an anchor, but potentially continuing past into year 1 and year 2. Jessica, oh man, what's her new surname? McCurdy, criminy. I could only think of the former one. I am so tired today. But Jessica McCurdy is a really an excellent example to watch for that, maintaining shaping.
Yeah.
And then another thing that is an interesting element of listening is understanding what's the constant in the connection and in the musicality versus what's the variable, and which role is dominating that spectrum at any given time. So like, for example, here, because Jewel is the one that is doing rotation and something in general much larger, there are more variables to what he's doing, whereas there are fewer variables to what Chantelle is doing. And so another way of thinking about her choice, and again, this may not be the way she was thinking of it, but this is a way that can maybe help if you enjoy trying on different mindsets as a dancer, being like, oh, my partner is doing a lot right now, so I'll take a step back.
Yeah, I think that's a really good mindset to have when your partner is doing a lot, just kind of hanging back and letting them have a moment and do what they're doing.
Kind of an extension of what I was just talking about is when your partner is adding a lot of variables and you stand back and let them have it, as it were, and listen and see if they're inviting you to join in or not. That's part of listening. But then to balance that out, it's often helpful, especially if you're in the leader's position, then turn the tables. So Joel just did a thing, and now it's Chantelle's turn to do a thing. Very, very simple. And some teachers use the terms you go, I go, we go. The idea being one partner kind of gets the spotlight for a hot second, and then it's the next partner's turn to get the spotlight for a second. And then after that, you do something in sync together. And that's a really easy way, well, not necessarily easy, but a simple framework for creating balanced musicality and play in a partnership, especially at the competitive levels.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's a framework, so you don't have to think too much about it. It's just something that you have in mind, so it's easy to follow through with.
Yeah, and it's easier to keep track of. It's like, oh, you just did a thing. It's my turn. I just did a thing. It's your turn. Hey, maybe we'll do this thing together this time.
Yep.
And then just tiny side note, I love Chantelle's eye direction and intention through this moment, where she looks down the slot and then kind of closes her eyes demurely, but keeps her head like back over her left shoulder for a long time. Such a lovely choice.
Yeah, that's something that we see fairly frequently with Estelle, where you'll kind of more engage in front of you for a moment and then kind of come back to the partnership. And that's something that really does require some teamwork, because like in the situation, if you're Joel, you can see that she has her attention kind of sent out elsewhere. So you don't want to change too much. So you let her have her moment.
Mm-hmm.
And for Chantelle, like it's really important for her to take the moment, but not take too long to come back to her partnership and say, okay, I'm back. We're good.
Yeah. And it also has the interesting effect of, because of where her head and her eyes are focused, it has this uncanny effect of slowing down her movement almost in the way we perceive it. So like, yes, this is a slower dance and yes, the movement is slower in general. But if she had from right here snapped her head back to Joel and still taken the same steps at the same rate that she is now, that would have perceived that as faster than the way her head direction is in this, what is actually in the video. I told you my English was going to be fun tonight.
Fun so far.
Oh man, I can feel like the gears up in here are dusty and they need some WD-40. Is that kind of brain I've got right now?
Love those days. I think one other thing that I want to point out here is, can you go back to when Chantelle comes back around?
Yeah, this one.
So, yeah. So like right as she's coming out of this, right? So she has this tether, she's walking around, and you can tell she's already like intending away from Joel. So then when she comes back into the slotted position with him, she's still like intending back away from him now. And that's something that's really important for teamwork, is for the follow specifically to really make sure that their technique is solid so that they're able to hang back. Because one thing that really kind of screws with teamwork is follows getting ahead of themselves, because then they're moving without being led through it. And it like leaves the lead being like, okay, well, I'm not sure what's happening because now my follow is already coming towards me, but I didn't really want that. So it's super important to have that solid anchoring technique where you are intending away from your partner in order to like hang back and be led through it. A lot of times what you'll see is, especially if you're not getting a lot of countering from your partner, you'll see follows be more like upright right over the middle of their feet in terms of like where they're balanced. But then a lot of times that ends up in them kind of more tipping forward to the toes, and they're falling into whatever they're doing next. And that's what creates that like ahead of what's going on kind of movement. So I wanted to mention that Chantelle does a really lovely job of hanging out and waiting for Joel to start moving her again.
Yep. And that actually brings up something I'd love to add, because one of the things I see a lot in newer follows is that they're focusing on getting this side of their body away down the slot. But if their right shoulder isn't engaged with the connection, it's going to disconnect that right shoulder. And no matter how far away you get this side of your body, the leader isn't going to feel it in the handhold. So making sure that that hanging back that Alicia was talking about is getting communicated through an engaged right shoulder is one of the keys that I feel gets left out a lot of the time. It seems like really obvious when I say it, but so many follows that I've worked with in the past have struggled with this exact same thing, which is why I'm mentioning it.
Yeah.
Just a brief highlight for this 3 and 4 right here. So it is accurate to say that the 3 and 4 of a whip is just an anchor inside of a pattern because it's a redirection.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love the breath and grounding that we see both of them do as they strike into her left foot, his right foot. And you can see there's like this little bit of a down and up that they go through. And it's absolutely lovely.
Yeah. And that's not because they're just moving themselves down and up. It's because of them anchoring, redirecting.
Super
That's
slow
just what it
motion,
creates.
so it's easy to see.
Yeah. So what's creating that for Chantelle is her kind of sitting back as she's releasing that right knee forward.
Keyword being forward, not up.
Right.
No prancing. That's the difference.
Accurate. Yep. So we've talked about weight supported moves recently, and this is a really lovely one. It does require a lot of teamwork, in particular because Joel is allowing Chantelle to take her time to move through it. So he's kind of, once he's putting her into this and she kind of has her position, she is then kind of deciding how long she wants to take to continue through it. Right. So where that takes over is once she uses her right leg, right? So initially she doesn't use it apart from just like a normal foot strike, whatever. But then once she gets to that point, right about here, she has to start using the thigh. And that's kind of when it takes like her, like, what am I trying to say? That's when she kind of takes over for really how much she's moving through all of this. The way I like to think of this type of movement is the lead does the first half, the follow finish is the second half. And that's not to say that Joel isn't doing anything. He's following her more so.
And then one thing that is really helpful, because Chantelle is a narrow person and Joel has nice long arms, is they're able to get into this connection at the very beginning where his right arm is basically all the way across her chest and wrapped around. So his right hand is actually on her back, which is incredible. Yeah. And she is able to hook her right hand below and up over behind his right shoulder. You can see it right here. And that set of circumstances just makes this really stable for her. So she has connection points on the left side of her body and the right side of her body to really balance out her center. Not everyone has the luxury of this with a partner and a weight support. So I just want to highlight that this is something that is playing in their favor for this kind of connection.
Yeah. And I love that we don't just rotate right back around into like facing each other position coming out of this. It's really nice. She just kind of keeps it going because she's already kind of flowing in that direction just because of how she's coming up out of this. So she already has quite a bit of energy that way. So rather than trying to stop that and rotate it, she just kind of allows it to follow through. And Joel does a really good job of following her instead of like stopping her right there.
Yeah.
That's important. Like once you get to this back half, like you should kind of go with where the follow is going because if you're not doing that, that's when we get these like awkward like follows or having to do a lot of work all of a sudden to like hold themselves in this particular shape and place. And that's not ideal.
There are a couple of things I want to add for Joel. First of all, when he comes up out of this lunge, the way he drags in kind of like a relaxed pointed toe, not just like it's just the edge of his toe, but the inside of his toe. It's a really lovely technique detail that I really appreciate. Mm-hmm. So in addition to what Alicia said about letting this momentum that very much is going this way, just letting that happen and not fighting it, I want to add that the moment that a leader decides to start adding rotation to this situation is really important. And it's based on which foot the follow has just struck to the floor and where in their weight transfer to that foot they are. So if Joel had wanted to go right into a rock and go, this would be the moment where he would have had to have changed something. She has just struck this foot and started transferring weight over it, but it is not 100% yet. He would very much need to rotate this side of her body like whoop, really quickly and probably scroll his body away to allow that to happen. But like Alicia talked about, that's just not an appropriate musical choice here. But I wanted to highlight that as technically an option. Yeah. And then the next point where it becomes appropriate, and you can see it, he's swinging his hand up as she's striking her right foot to prepare to swing it down into his right, her left, as she is finishing her weight transfer over this foot. And that's what's leading her to rotate left into her shoulder pocket, as I call it. And that moment where you start communicating that is so important. I feel like a lot of leaders are late, and you need to be making sure that you're giving the follow information. If you want them to finish transferring their weight in a particular way, they need to have that information beforehand. Mm-hmm. So we get another pair of rides, and it's she goes and he goes. And it's a really lovely choice. Yeah. And unlike the ride at the very beginning, because of the way Chantelle is prepping and then almost like driving her left leg forward, is applying a lot of power to the ride. Man, my quad is cramping just watching this. Which means it's a more accelerated ride than the one we saw at the very beginning. And that's the kind of thing that Joel needs to be really sensitive to. Yeah. And he'll be sensitive to it in his right hand, because that's where in the chain, her left foot, that side of her body, it will be communicating to his right hand. And because there's an acceleration and an increase in weight, he knows to speed up, essentially, in walking around her. And you can see how he's doing a really lovely job of staying as close to her standing foot with his right foot as possible to stay stable until they start coming out of it. Yeah. And then he does one. And it's much easier as a leader. It's easier to lead a ride for yourself than it is to lead a ride for a follow and then follow how they go into it. Because like we were talking about earlier, like you can lead the beginning of a ride for a follow, but then you need to be able to counterbalance and adjust continually as you go through. Whereas when you're the one that's literally driving the whole thing, you have much more control. And he's throwing her isn't the right word, but there is so much energy that he's communicating into the connection that she basically has no choice but to side cross.
Yeah.
Like if she didn't, it would not end well.
No.
And then the way Joel preps it is a really great example of that hip weight I was talking about earlier, because he's taller, he has longer legs, and you can see how much he really almost goes into an arabesque behind him, and then he closes that leg to the side really quickly. Like the transition between those two is really fast, and then he's also following through with his head weight, turning further to his right, past his right shoulder with his head. And so that's creating a lot of energy. And she's just along for the ride going, wee. It's very fun.
Pretty much. And I also want to add that he does a really great job of like kind of gauging how much energy he's putting into it, because had he gone into this the exact same way but had his leg up higher, it would be too much weight back for Chantelle to counter him well. So really even though he's swinging around for that acceleration, he's actually like kind of dissipating a little bit of that energy, so it's still accelerated, but she is able to counter him. So I wanted to mention that.
Yeah. And I don't know. So it's interesting. When I was first becoming more advanced as a leader and I was learning how to do rides and stuff, I didn't struggle at all with it. Like once I understood what I was doing, no problem. But then something in the next few years in follow technique, I want to say it has to do with how pitch was being communicated, made it so that if I affected a follow's shoulder line with energy to basically, like, see right here, he is attached to her shoulder and elbow, which means he's talking to this plane of her body, and he's basically taking that off of her standing foot, and she has to shuffle underneath herself to keep her feet under her upper body, which is moving faster than her feet, right? But what I found technique wise is that follows did not have the ability to pick up their feet underneath them when their upper body got moved. And so I ended up just knocking them over. And like, it was very interesting because and I think it was the same period of time where I kind of gave up on leading telemarks because follows weren't powering their own turns anymore. And I had to do all of the work to get them to travel not only past me but across the slot for me to do a telemark. I'm really curious to see what happens when I start social dancing again. Knock on wood, I get my knee surgery this summer. Because those are patterns that, because they were kind of just sad to lead for a few years, I just kind of just stopped leading them in general, except for very unique circumstances. So I have less of a feel for what the kind of global technique is in follows. But I just thought I'd mention that because it was a very fascinating thing to experience, because I was becoming a better and better leader, but there was something that the follows were learning that was making those things harder.
Probably pitch. When your feet are just glued into the floor.
It's like, no, I shall not go anywhere. I don't know where that accent came from. I'm sorry.
Side note, but because I mentioned that, if you are feeling like you're having problems getting your feet off of the floor in time, it's probably your pitch. So check that out.
It's always pitch. It's always, it comes back to that.
This is a really, really nice example of like you doing something, your partner doing something, you doing something, but it's also a great example of just both of them kind of listening, right? So Joel couldn't power that slide if he didn't know what Chantelle was doing and where she was at. And Chantelle wouldn't know to like hang out there. And B, she would probably end up moving in a different way? Had she just kind of started moving on her own rather than following the energy that she was being given based on where their connection was at?
Yeah, I just want to highlight how calm the handhold is until
Mm-hmm.
he passes her. So as soon as he starts moving towards her, the handhold isn't going as fast as he is. He's moving faster towards the handhold. And then basically when he
Yeah.
runs into it with his hip, that's when it starts affecting her. And the way she
Mm-hmm.
tethers and rotates into it is just so beautiful.
Yeah.
But I just want to highlight, he's not like shoving her away. He's resisting her away, just like a boring old push break technique. The follow extends the leader's arm, not the other way around. And he's resisting that. And then he's continuing to resist it. It's like he's pulling. It's like he's doing an upright row, essentially.
Yeah.
He's pulling into
He's
that
pulling
handhold.
himself.
Yeah.
Himself.
It's like when it's a center counterpoint, you're pulling against a stable point in space because it's being counterbalanced on the other side. If he were to do more than she is giving, it would break that balance and she would get yanked towards him. So it's within the balance of the ecosystem of the handhold, babying the center counterpoint. And then when it becomes like he cannot bring the handhold any closer to him without defying the laws of physics, he slows himself down and he gently lets it affect her. And really the only thing, like the handhold is just moving down the slot. There isn't any other variable to it, which is allowing her to tether it in a relaxed fashion. The handhold is not also going up or down. It's just continuing past her.
Yeah. If Chantelle had not been just really paying attention to what Joel was doing, she probably wouldn't have followed through in such a like natural motion.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's a really lovely shape that she makes.
Mm-hmm. I also appreciate how Joel isn't necessarily trying to do anything besides the heel slide. He's not like pitching back into it. He's not turning up the volume on it so much. It's beyond the tone of the song. So it still remains appropriate within what kind of musicality the song is asking for.
Yeah.
That's probably a good thing to talk about.
Yeah.
Let there be arms. So one of the things that can be really, once you know to look for it, it becomes like really obvious to you when partnerships are this in tune with each other. But the kind of down and up tethered arcs to a push break through this anchor right here. So I want you to pay attention to their connected handhold. So it comes in and it's an exaggerated push tuck because Joel shifted to the opposite side of the slot, which allows Chantelle's right side to not only come more forward, but more around. So she has a center axis. So she's going to spin in place.
Yeah.
But then what she does is her hip weight follows or leads out of it first, and her shoulders delay behind, and then her head. And you can see how straight her right arm is. And Joel is allowing that to happen. And he's being very gentle. He's like following it. So that way he's not hurting her shoulder in any way. But then now from here, it not only has to come towards him, but it has to move down in order for Chantelle to start feeling like a normal anchor again. But then you can notice how it's still basically at his shoulder height. When it finally comes down to her shoulder height is when it's encouraging her to settle. And it's doing this really, it's like a swing from up to his right, down, and then up to his left. And that swing is making the connection just so delicious between the
Yeah.
two of them. And it also has the added benefit of prepping her to do another turn right afterwards.
So you can see that she has that right side of her body really stretched out. And so generally we don't want to have arms that are kind of straight like this, but it's because of that like stretching of that right side of her body. That's just kind of what's natural to happen at that point. Try it like try stretching the right side of your body and not doing anything with the arm and like having it down. It's a little bit more awkward. So it's just like the natural thing to extend all the way through. And so she's just kind of allowing that to go along with the rest of what she's doing. She's not so much like intentionally placing it there. It's just kind of already at that height. And then when she's coming around, that's just what's happening. So I just wanted to mention that because generally we don't want to see these types of arms. But because she has total control over what's going on and because of the way that she's going through stretching, it's just naturally happening. So
yeah, it's an effect as opposed to the cause.
Right.
So if you find yourself just going hiya into the air, it's either you're doing hustle, which fine, great, awesome, have fun, or maybe don't. All right, now we're getting into complex town. So I just want to highlight that these kind of illusion breaks, they're similar to like broken wrist turns in that it's an illusion. He's quote unquote breaking through the handhold, which I guess he's not actually disconnecting it, is he? But this is one of those things where he could actually disconnect the handhold right there and it would look like he judo chopped the situation. But whenever you're doing that, you're doing it to the handhold that you could just let go of. So it's an illusion. It's very important detail there.
Yeah.
I would say because he is maintaining that connection, what's really important is really getting that handhold in his armpit, basically. Yeah. So that's making sure she's going to have as much arm length as possible. If it were somewhere else, things would get complicated. And then he is really arching into his back and relaxing his head backward. So that way she doesn't have to reach past what is comfortable for her. He's doing all of the compensating right here so she can feel comfortable. And that is like super important. And then another thing, it might seem odd, but one option is to spot your partner's chest to gauge distance. So that way you're not accidentally headbutting someone's chest. Like
ideally.
I don't know about other follows, but if like that's why you're going to stare for a hot second, I am okay with it because I would rather that than awkward contact.
Yeah. I also want to point out just briefly how Joel is balancing himself going through this rotation. So coming into it, he has the right arm swinging up, the left leg is swinging out, so those are balanced. And then once he's swinging through, because of the way that he's like rolling the body around, like barrel roll, he has to make sure that that left leg of his is not really moving. It's like sliding under him as he's turning, but the majority of the movement is happening in that right front foot. And even still, it's pretty like on the ground. So he has a lot of weight back, like towards that back foot. But he still has that right foot in contact with the ground so that you can have a little bit more like sensory information. So I just wanted to mention how he was balancing that because he does a really good job of it.
Basically, what's happening is he's placing this directly underneath his head, and then he's going to leave his hips there as he rotates. So you can see as he goes through this rotation, the relationship between his big body pieces isn't that much different. the main thing is that he's gotten closer to Chantelle. But if this foot were not out in front of him at the beginning, if it were back near this foot, or heaven forbid, further back here, he would have been falling into Chantelle's space. So making sure that this foot is placed there, very important for that rotation. All right. So he went. Now it's her turn. And I just love what she chooses to do with it, because he's leading just a very simple, like, okay, it's your turn to turn now. He's leading from her wrist, which means she has her whole arm to get under, which is really important. And then she's just deciding to maintain that really close connection and sink into it in the most delightful way. We'll get the crosshairs out of
It's really nice. Yeah. I also want to mention that these type of like arm wraps, you need to be really careful with those, because there's so much contact and it's intertwined. So it's something that you really need to be very aware of what your partner is doing in that moment. And as a follow, generally I prefer to just like relax myself and let my lead move me into whatever they want to do next. Generally it's like a rotation of some sort, but I try not to fight it and try to just be ready to place my feet wherever. It's safer. So
and be ready to abort this kind of corkscrew or infinity connection in the arms. Just be ready to abort that if you need to. Next time we are going to be analyzing Ben Morris and Tori Zowie from is it City of Angels?
I think so, yeah.
And we're going to be talking about playfulness, because that was such a fun dance. And we've got another What Went Wrong workshop, I think, for June 18th. So find that on our Facebook page.
Alrighty. Well, if there's no questions, thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. We'll talk to you later. Points don't matter. We are here to help. Wow. We are here to help. Hi, Coco. Is there any preamble you want to do?
A little bit.
Coco, you have some
I don't get interrupted.
Star Wars side note, but I saw this like meme somewhere where some youngin was like, how did Anakin get Rey's lightsaber? And I'm like, oh no. It was Anakin's first. I hate to break it to you, but okay then. We'll give Alicia a moment to let Coco out. I love how you had to use the ball to like get her out of there.
Yeah, she wanted to stay, but
I remember the first time I got a pair of ballroom shoes that was designed for heel slides. Oh,
sounds like fun.
Oh geez. And it was when I was also still doing ballroom and stuff, so that whole like particularly for waltz, where you really like squat down and pitch backwards to extend your leg out in front of you for a heel strike before you move forward. I cannot tell you how many times in those days I just got the right angle, and instead of having any sort of stability to then like transition my weight over that foot, it would just go
no.
Oh man, because like in my early days I was jazz and tap. One did not worry about those things too much, but suddenly ballroom, what? I
totally different.
Didn't realize the shoes helped facilitate this shenanigans, but apparently they do. We should have come with the warning label. Anyways,